Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. So this is one of my favorite books. It's called Someday is Today, and it's filled with incredibly actionable, helpful, practical advice for achieving more of the things we want in life. It's written by an incredible guy called Mathew Dicks, who has survived 3 near-death experiences, including a ridiculously bad car crash and also being held at gunpoint at the age of 22. And these experiences forced him to reconsider what he was doing with his life and what he achieved. And he went from being someone who was completely broke, living in his car and working at McDonald's, to becoming a best-selling author, world champion storyteller, and award-winning journalist.
I was sure that I was going to die that day. And I will tell you that I did not feel fear or sadness or anger. The only feeling I was consumed with was regret. I was 22 years old and I had failed to do anything with my life that I had wanted to do.
That was a quote from a podcast that I did with Matthew a few months ago. Incredible episode. But in this episode of Book Club, which is the ongoing series where we distill and discuss highlights and summaries from some of my favorite books, I'm going to talk through 7 actionable tips that I took from his latest book, Someday is Today. These are 7 tips that will help you achieve more of what you want in life. Let's get into it. Tip number 1, the parking lot practice. So when I first started writing my book, Feel Good Productivity, I felt like I had to do it in the right environment. I felt like I had to go into a coffee shop and have my little latte next to me and my headphones on, and I wanted the environment to be perfect. Otherwise, for some reason I felt this writer's block and I felt like I couldn't do the thing. But Matthew's approach to this is completely different, and his approach has actually changed the way that I approach my creative work, and I think you can get a lot of value from this as well. And one of my favorite quotes from the book is that productivity is not pretty. Now, we've all seen those examples of the students that are doing their notes in the most elaborate, colorful method possible. We've seen those sketch notes. We've seen all these people with their incredibly pretty desks and everything, and it just looks like such a productive vibe and it looks very pretty. But the point that Matthew is making is that true productivity does not have to look pretty. And the example that he talks about in the book is where he was early for a dentist appointment. And so instead of just sort of waiting in the car or scrolling TikTok or whatever the thing was, instead of doing that, he decided to just sit on the side of the road in the parking lot, get out his laptop and continue writing some more of the novel that he was working on.
During World War I, there were men in trenches wearing gas masks, artillery exploding over their heads, and they were scribbling in little books, in journals, hoping that if they survived this battle and the many battles that were to come, someday they might publish something. So thank goodness that the writers of the 1910s did not require Starbucks smooth jazz and 2-hour quiet blocks of time for them to get their work done.
His point is that there's never going to be a perfect place or a perfect setting to get things done, especially when your life is chaotic, especially when you have kids. I don't have kids, but he does, and so he would know. And if you're always waiting for the right time or the right environment to be able to do a thing that propels your creative life forward, or to do a thing that you really want to do, you're going to be waiting for a very, very, very long time. It's the same with eating healthily. It's the same with going to the gym. It's the same with building a business. The timing is never going to be right. The time is now, or the time is never. And the people who can take action on the things that they want to do, despite the imperfect environment, are the ones who ultimately succeed and ultimately move forward with what they want in life. Tip number 2, the minutes mindset. So the point here is that when we plan out our day, we tend to think in blocks of hours. But thinking in hours can actually cause us to waste quite a lot of time. Now in the book he talks about this, and this is one of my favorite stories in any book that I've ever read. He talks about how he was meeting up with a person who wanted to write a book, and he was meeting up with her for breakfast.
She met me at the McDonald's and she was late. And so when she sat down, I said, tell me what you're doing. And she started describing this book. And then eventually I said, as I always say to writers, I say, so how much have you written? And so often, almost always, the answer is, oh, well, I haven't started writing anything yet. And then I said to her, I said, well, you were 7 minutes late today. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm like, no, my point was not that you were 7 minutes late and I was upset. My point was, I used the 7 minutes that you were late to write some sentences. I turned my computer, I said, this is what I wrote in the 7 minutes that you were late.
And I just absolutely love this approach. After Matthew's near-death experiences, he says that he realized the profound value of time, and he didn't want to come to the end of his life with regret for failing to achieve the things that he actually wanted to do. And so what he tries to do now is he tries to get the most out of every single minute rather than every single hour.
I tell all of the creative people of the world, 10 minutes is precious to you. It doesn't mean in 10 minutes I can write a chapter. In 10 minutes, I can reread the last 3 paragraphs I wrote earlier today and see if they're okay and clean them up a little bit. Or I can write 5 good new sentences.
And this is actually how I was able to grow this YouTube channel while I was working for 2 years full-time as a doctor. This book hadn't come out yet, but at that time I had a similar attitude in that in between patients, or in my lunch break, or in a random break here and there, when I had a few minutes of time, I would get out my phone or I would go on Notion on the Windows computers at work, and I would just make a few more notes on a video that I was working on. And so what that meant is that in these little blocks of time here and there throughout the day, where other people around me were scrolling TikTok on their phones or whatever, in those moments I was writing more bullet points for a video or fleshing out some title ideas or figuring out a thumbnail. And in this context, me and Mathew are absolutely not saying that there is no time for a break and that you should never ever recharge and relax. In fact, the whole final 3 chapters of my book, Feel Good Productivity, are all about the power of rest and relaxation to make things sustainable over time. But the way to think about this is that what do you find yourself doing in those pockets of time? Do you wait until it hits like 5 o'clock to be able to do something because you have to start on the hour? What if you just had 3 minutes or 5 or 7 or 9 minutes left? Could you do something intentional and effective and enjoyable with that time rather than wasting that time on scrolling whatever thing that you tend to default to? Oh, and by the way, one of the productivity tools that I use every single day that really helps me make the most of my time is what I call the year at a glance spreadsheet. It's basically a Google sheet that has the entire year laid out, and it's a way of visualizing the calendar that you just don't really get within calendar apps. And there's going to be a link in the video description where you can download this completely for free if you want a better way for planning your year as well. All right, tip number 3 is the Lilypad Method. Now in the book, Mathew writes that the only real failure for any creator is to stop making stuff. Now by making stuff, it could be writing, it could be YouTube videos, it could be studying for your exam, it could be learning to code, it could be starting that business or working on your sales script. So, all of this stuff is what I would call creative in some ways. But sometimes doing this stuff can feel really overwhelming, especially with everything else going on in our lives. And especially if you have a big project that you're working on, like trying to study for a massive exam, or like trying to write a novel, or trying to start a business and get it off the ground. There's often a lot of little steps involved in that thing, but if you look at the whole thing, it can seem like a mountain that feels very daunting to climb. Now, normally the conventional path towards working towards our goals is to do things in sequence, in order, one at a time. But the Lilypad method is kind of Mathew's approach to this, which is to recognize that you don't actually need to start at the beginning and you don't need to finish at the end. You can in fact jump around.
I think sometimes people see a goal or a dream as a linear process, like A to B to C. And I think that's always a mistake too. So I was working with someone yesterday who said, I want to write a memoir. And I said, well, start writing a memoir. And she said, I don't know where to start. And I said, do you have some good moments that you know you want to include? She said, oh yeah. I said, well, write those. She said, don't you have to start a book at the beginning? I said, no, you write something. Just write chapter 15 if that's what you can write today. So seeing your dream as stepping stones, but you get to touch whichever one you want at any point, because you're gonna have to touch all of them eventually. That's really helpful.
So if you figure out what is the goal that you're trying to go for, and then you break it down into these tasks, but instead of seeing these tasks as things that have to happen in sequence, if you can think of them as almost like lily pads, where you can sort of leapfrog around these different lily pads depending on your mood and depending on how you're feeling. Well, then in those moments where you feel overwhelmed by a particular task, or you feel like you don't have the motivation or the discipline or whatever you want to call it, you can then just leapfrog to another lily pad and you can make progress in that direction. I also did an interview with writer Mo Gaudat, who's written a bunch of books. He's amazing. He's like a world expert in happiness research, stuff like that. But I asked him about his writing habit and how he managed to write so many books. And what he said was that he always works on like 5 or 6 different books in parallel. And so every day he spends a few hours writing.
I wake up sometimes in the morning and I write for 3, 4, 5 hours.
But every morning he asks himself, which is the project that I feel most pulled right now to be working on? And he just works on that one.
I loved the journey of writing it. I loved the journey of exploration. I loved the analysis, the research. I loved the conversation I had with a friend to say, does this make sense to you? I love all of that. And it's, you know what? It's hours of my life that are filled with joy.
He's not forcing himself to stick to one particular project or one particular task. In a way, he leapfrogs around depending on how his energy is going on a particular day. And so the question to ask yourself to take something away from this point is, when it comes to the goals that I'm pursuing, how might I be able to start in the middle with some of them rather than necessarily starting at the beginning? And in moments where I feel overwhelmed with a particular task, is there a way I can leapfrog that particular task and do something else that takes me towards my goals? Okay, tip number 4 is the horizon habit. Now, you've probably heard of SMART goals, which is goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, or assignable, realistic or relevant, and T for time-bound. But the problem with setting these sorts of goals is that often we can set them towards things that are actually outside of our control. Like if you want to start a YouTube channel, but you set a specific goal of hitting 1 million subscribers, which is specific and measurable and time-bound and all that kind of stuff, it's a goal that's kind of out of your control, and so it can be very demotivating trying to get there. And so the way Mathew thinks about this is setting horizon goals instead. And I really like this way of thinking about it, because the way I think about goals is that goals are ultimately just a destination. They don't actually help us get there, they're just the destination. And so horizon goals are just a way of taking the pressure off of the idea of goal setting and explicitly allowing us to set a general, vague, directional goal that's like over there on the horizon, but it's not really that specific.
I like to identify that idea of I'm going to be a storyteller, but that I'm going to be a storyteller also allows, because it's on the horizon, to be, maybe I'll teach storytelling someday. Maybe I'll be a consultant about storytelling. Maybe an advertising company will allow me to inject storytelling into their car commercials, which is what I've done, right? All of those things are sort of on the storytelling horizon, but it affords me the opportunity to be flexible in terms of what ultimately is going to happen.
So if your goal is to be a musician, you might think about all the other ways you can incorporate that dream into your career. You could become a band member, but you could also try songwriting or DJing or radio presenting. You could learn how to produce music and become a technician, or a background singer who picks up an event management job, or a teacher or an online creator sharing insights into the music world. All of these jobs are crucially on the music horizon, but this flexibility gives you both freedom and also resilience, which brings us to the next point in the book, which is tip number 5, the piano precedent. And there's a great quote from the book, which is that 5-year plans are inviting the universe to drop a piano on you. Basically, if you try and meticulously plan out your life, then it's inevitable that something is going to happen that will completely ruin your plans. Now, that's not to say that planning is not important, because making a plan is generally quite helpful, and we've talked about setting a horizon goal as your destination so you can start working towards it. And generally, when I find people come to me for life advice and I ask them, well, what do you actually want? They don't really have a vision of where they actually want to go. And it's like that quote from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland: if you don't know where you're going, then any road will get you there.
But I just wanted to ask you which way I ought to go.
Well, that depends on where you want to get to.
Oh, it really doesn't matter. As long as I can...
Then it really doesn't matter which way you go.
And there's a graph that I really like. I think it's from Darren Brown's book Happy, which is basically all about stoicism, which is where you've got your plans on one axis and then you've got fate on the other axis. And the path that your life takes is sort of somewhere in between these two things. You're very unlikely to always be going in the same direction as your plans, but equally having some sort of plan will allow you to not just be completely buffeted by the winds of fate, and you'll be able to sort of chart your ship in those waters of fate. Tip number 6, the 100-year-old plan. Now, in Mathew Dicks' thingy, I think it's one of the early chapters in his book, which I really liked, which is that when you're at a crossroads in life, try to imagine your 100-year-old self and think to yourself, what advice would my 100-year-old self give to me right now? Now, the example that he uses is where he's sitting at his desk and he's writing and he's got deadlines and he's got work and he's got stuff to do, but then his son comes up to him and asks him to play tag. Now, one option in that path is to continue with work because you've got to be disciplined and you can't be distracted and you've got to focus. But then he thinks, what would his 100-year-old self want him to do? And his 100-year-old self is always going to say, look man, go play with the kid, because there's going to come a day where the kid no longer wants to play with you and you want to take advantage of the moments where the kid is actually keen to play tag with you. Now, similarly, Alex Hormozi's approach to this, he calls it the Solomon Project, is when he does journaling, but he imagines the journaling session as a conversation between him and his 86-year-old self.
A practice that I started doing, which is I have a coaching session with myself. Weird. I have a conversation with my future self, who's 85, and I ask him for advice on what I should do now.
And he knows that the 86-year-old has context on where he is at right now and what his goals are and what he needs, and he knows that the advice that the 86-year-old gives him is going to be, well, the right advice. And again, there's so much value in this kind of thinking, right? Because the more short-term we think of our life trajectory and the more short-term our decision-making, the more we tend to make decisions based on what's urgent rather than what's actually important. Honestly, this is still something I really struggle with. Far too often when it's a choice between friends and work, I'll think, oh, but work's really fun and I've got this deadline, I've got all this stuff, and so I'll choose work, when actually I know that my older self will have wanted me to choose friends or family or relationships or health in that moment. And tip number 7 is the purposeful approach. Now, often when we talk about productivity, and this is fundamentally a productivity book, it's easy to default to thinking that productivity means work or hustling or business or money, that kind of stuff. But sometimes we need to take a step back and really think about why we want to get things done efficiently.
So when people say productivity sort of grinds you down, I think of productivity as it's the thing that you want to be doing that you should be doing more of. So let's maximize our life, the things we have to do in order to sustain life, in order to get to the things we want to do. So we don't have to think of productivity in terms of work.
So the way I think of it is that I want to be making the most of my time, not for its own sake, or not because I want to maximize economic output, but actually by making the most of my time, it frees me up to be able to spend my time doing the things that truly matter to me. And this is why Mathew is a big fan of what he calls soft goals, which are things that aren't necessarily productive if you look at like the standard definitions of productivity, but that are intentional and that are meaningful to us anyway. So the action point here is figure out what are the soft goals that you want to aim for in life? What are the things that like someone else looking at it might not think it's particularly productive, but for you, it's very intentional, it's very satisfying, and it brings you the sense of meaning and fulfillment?
I was talking to a client the other day and I said, well, what's your horizon goal? And she said, I want to see the 50 greatest movies of all time. There's a list in the world. I have the list and I want to sit on my couch and watch the 50 greatest movies. She said, but that doesn't feel super productive. And I said, that sounds incredibly productive to me because it's your dream. Let's make sure we maximize your work time, your chore time. Let's take away all of those little black holes of your life that you're wasting and make sure that we use all that so you can get your ass on the couch more often with your husband watching black and white movies.
And so now, if you can be really productive in the areas of your life like your work or like your studies or whatever the thing might be, you free yourself up. You unlock a lot more time and energy to be able to give to the things that truly matter to you. Now, as you might know, I am completely obsessed with reading productivity books, which is why I ended up actually writing one, link down below. But if you're interested in my top insights from most of the productivity books I read, check out this video over here, which summarizes 107 productivity books that I've read into a 9-step framework that you can use to level up your productivity and do more of the things that matter to you. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you hopefully in the next video. Bye-bye.